Today we're going to do an acorn. Now here's the finished artwork in front of you, which you would see in your notes anyway. You have the option of working on colored paper today. Now I happen to have colored the paper with Brusho, and the explanation will follow. However, you're more than welcome to just work on a slightly darker shade of paper. The explanation in the video and on the notes does deal with working on colored paper, so the technique is slightly different to that if you were working on white paper. But I think it's rather nice to have a chance to work on colored paper, and this is the Clairefontaine pastel matte, and it's been tinted with Brusho, explanation to follow. But you equally could use watercolor. If Brusho sends you off into the pits of despair, then try a bit of watercolor. It works just fine, or even acrylic paint. Okay, so here are the pencils. They are all listed on your requirements list, but as you can see, not a huge range. Just bear in mind yours are very likely to be different to these. Those are the ones I've chosen for my color palette on the finished artwork, but you could be choosing something completely different. It really doesn't matter at all. Here we have the background that you might be interested to try. I have no idea how it's going to turn out, but it might be really successful. I've chosen this sort of yellowish beige color simply because, with it being acorns and autumn leaves, for some of you who have never come across Brusho, Brusho is a very, very interesting medium. It's basically a dry powdered ink, and it explodes into a myriad of different colors and so on and so forth when it has been wet. Let me show you what I mean. When you get your Brusho pot, please do not take the lid off. You don't need much Brusho, and if you take the lid off, you're going to get far too much on your paper. You just need to make a little hole in the lid. Here you can see I have simply used a map pin, a drawing pin, and I've just made a little hole. So when I upend it and give it a few gentle taps at the back, I only get a few speckles, and that is all you need. This piece of paper is Clairefontaine Pastel Matte. It has a very interesting corky kind of finish to it. Although it is designed primarily for pastel work, it's extremely successful for colored pencil work. And so we're going to just create a rather interesting background on here. So let's just start with a little dark brown. And I'm just going to sprinkle a little dark brown around. Again, it's a bit of a guessing game. You're not quite sure what's going to happen. I'm now going to put a little moss green in with it. Because after all, although it's autumnal, we may well still have a little bit of green in the trees. I'm going to use another green, which is olive green. When they come out of the container, they don't look anything like the color they're actually going to end up. So, you know, the moss green, or rather the olive green, looks actually quite orangey as I sprinkle it on the paper. It isn't orangey when I'm finished with it, once I've sprayed it. I'm also going to put a bit of something called sandstone. You don't need many colors, but I think I will put some just to a bit of interest. And I have to bear in mind, I have no idea what this is going to turn out like. So the trick is to actually do a number of pieces of paper. If you are doing a whole Brusho day, is to do a number of pieces of paper, and you will use them for something, somewhere along the line, but you're not quite sure where. You can put more on at any stage as you are spritzing. Should you feel you want to put more on, feel free. Right, I'm just going to lift that up because the board has got a slight tilt. Same thing, I'm going to just start spritzing gently so that I don't push it around. The actual pressure of the air doesn't push it around. Then I'll put a little more on, and you can see it just exploding into all sorts of weird colors. Now, it's a tricky one, this, because if I leave it like that, that is how it's going to dry. It will just dry in these speckles, which can be very effective if you wanted that. However, if I put more water on so that it actually has room to move and it has something to move into, it becomes very interesting. Now, the problem is it's very, very difficult for me to actually quantify and say how much water I put on. It is something that if you're going to use this method, you need to experiment. You can see, however, I'm actually putting quite a bit on, because if I squirt again, it starts to move around. I can move it by squirting water. The more water you put on, the more it's going to move around. But it's a bit of a guessing game. I think I might just put a few more speckles here. And you can see as soon as it comes into contact with the water, let me just go a little closer so that you can actually see, it starts to move. It does its own thing entirely. You can actually watch it moving. If I tilt a little back that way, it just goes off and does its own thing. Now, it may look particularly bright at this early stage. Don't let that worry you, because remember, like any ink, it's going to dry a little paler. So although it may look very garish, you've got to just hope that something's going to come about. You can see what would happen too if although it all starts to mix, you can play with this medium amazingly. If you wait until it is dry enough but not absolute bone dry, and then just gently drop in a few little bits of water, as you can see what's happening there, you're going to get these little white marks appearing, which can be very effective. At the moment, this is too wet. It needs to actually get a little bit drier before those white marks will stay. Now, you can already see that section that a few minutes ago what had quite distinct lines have gone. It's gone already. And so you don't really know what is going to happen when you are working with Brusho. Let's just put a little more. I want just a little darker down the bottom here. So I'm just going in with a little more dark brown. I may spritz it a bit more just so that I'm sure it's got enough water in it to mix. And then it's tempting to keep spritzing. I now need to put that away and give it at least overnight to dry properly, but within a couple of hours it will have started to settle and it's not going to move anymore. So I will be back to show you the next step. The last little snippet of video showed the Brusho when it was still wet. Remember I said it will pale down once it is dry because it was a bit garish. Now here we have the piece of paper that was brushoed and it is now dry. I have taped it, as you will see, onto a piece of card simply because wetting the paper does make it buckle slightly. You can see it's paled down really quite nicely and it gives you an interesting swirly background on which to start working. Remember, you could turn it any way you liked. When you have decided on your composition for your artwork, you can work out which way you want it. I'm going to have it this way. Now, my inspiration was that photograph. I thought that was rather nice. However, I've got another photograph, and I also have a collection of acorns and bits and pieces that I picked up when I was walking the dogs. The leaves were a bit wet, so I didn't bring those in. And looking at all the bits that I have, that is my composition. I have decided, because I really liked the strength of tonal value in this image, I thought that would inspire me to do a really close-up and much enlarged drawing of an acorn. and an oak leaf, obviously, just so that it all sort of ties together. So here I have got my main acorn sketched in. I have worked on tracing paper. You'll see why just now. And then I've used this to help me get that section in accurately. It'll become more accurate as I draw it. And the oak leaves are not the dominant feature of the artwork. The focal point is going to be the acorns here. So now, because I have drawn it on tracing paper, it does mean that I can place it on my piece of brushed paper where I feel it would work best. I can see the colors through, not particularly well, but well enough for it to work. And I know, bear in mind, I had mentioned that tonal value was my main thought when I saw that photographic reference. I want this acorn to be particularly bright. And if I have a look, I can actually see that I've got a dark area behind that acorn, which means that the tonal range is going to be better. I've also got a really interesting section down here. Just because it looks nice, I would like to have that showing. So it's given me some idea as to where I'm actually going to place my artwork. Working on tracing paper, doing your sketching up on tracing paper is a very valuable tip. It means that you can play around with placement and you don't have to actually damage the good paper. This is even if you're working on good quality watercolor paper as well. It means you can move it here, you can move it there, and see where the best placement is. I could perhaps move it further in to that dark area, but I must bear in mind that I want to think about composition, and it's always better to have things slightly off center. So if I move it back there, I've got enough of the dark to show up the lightness of the acorn, and yet I've still got this interesting patch down here that's not going to be chopped off by a bit of mount board, and it gives me the illusion of space in front. So it's just a small thing, but it's something that's worth considering. Okay, I've done my pencil sketch on the front of my tracing paper. To get it transferred onto the Clairefontaine pastel mat, I'm going to turn it back to front, and I am going to use a pastel pencil. Pastel pencil. This happens to be a Caran d'Ache pastel pencil, but you could use any pastel pencil, or you could actually even use a stick pastel. And I'm simply, because I can see through it, going to go over it. I'm not pressing particularly hard. Let me put a piece of white paper again underneath so it's easier for you to see. I'm not pressing particularly hard. I'm not being particularly careful because it's going to all be covered up with a colored pencil. And wherever I've got a bit of graphite, I am simply going to put a little bit of pastel pencil, and that means it'll be easy enough to transfer it through. You'll see now as I go about it. So we'll just get that done quickly. It doesn't have to be in a very exact fashion. You could go around carefully, but at this stage my drawing is not particularly defined. The basics are in the right sort of place, but the actual drawing needs more definition. Bear in mind, this is quite individual. If you draw up and like a very precise image before you start, then you will find it actually easier to draw carefully around your precise image. I'm inclined to draw in rather a scruffy fashion to begin with, and so it's easier for me to do this. Right, so now I would say pretty much all my graphite has been covered at the back with pastel pencil. Do get rid of the little bit of pastel dust that may be around. Okay, now I'm going to make sure I know exactly where I want to place it. Thinking about where I'm putting what. And when I am happy with the placement, thinking that if it works out well and I may want to have a mount board around it, I've got to think what bits would be chopped off by the mount board. Once I am happy with the placement, you need to just give yourself a few reference marks. So I'm going to go, let me move that down so you can see, from the tracing paper onto my bit of masking tape, 2 lines, just with, this is just an ordinary graphite clutch pencil. And I'm going to do exactly the same on another side. So that should, as I am working through this move, it's easy enough for me to get it back to the correct position by lining up my lines. Now I am ready to actually transfer it. So I don't want to press too hard. I just want to check, is it coming through sufficiently? Maybe I need to press a weeny bit harder. Let me just check. Yes, it's coming through. I can see where I'm going more or less. And I just want to transfer it onto my paper. Using this method means that I am not going to damage the underlying paper by doing a whole lot of sketching and rubbing out and so on and so forth. So it is a useful means of transferring an artwork. And how precisely you do it, as we spoke about earlier, is really entirely up to you. You'll see how easy it is to make alterations when I get this off, and then you'll be able to have a look and see. And oh, I forgot to do that. Never mind, I can just freehand it in. And then you'll see that because I'm using pastel, it's really easy to make alterations if I need to. Let me just double check. Yes, it's all coming through absolutely fine. The pastel is a very, I forgot that as well. Never mind. The pastel is a very useful means, medium to use to transfer artworks onto another surface, because it, unless it's a very dark pastel you've used, which obviously in this instance you haven't used a dark one, it doesn't sort of damage the paper. It's easy to take it off with a kneadable eraser. So it can be quite useful. Right, that will probably be sufficient. I know I've left out 2 bits. Right, let me just put those 2 bits in. I'm just going to actually tickle them in with pastel. Obviously, in my haste, had not gone over it terribly carefully. That'll do. So you can see now you have your image down. However, it's easy to get rid of some of the image if you don't want it there. I could very easily go in with a soft kneadable eraser, and you can see it literally disappears. Any excess pastel dust that may have occurred as you've transferred it, it's very, very easy to lift it off. So it's a really useful means of transferring artwork onto another surface. Okay, now we're going to get started. We're going to start in a simple fashion. Bit by bit, we will go simply so that, sorry, I just need another piece of paper on which to rest my hand. And I prefer to be able to see through it. So tracing paper is quite useful. We're going to start off with the actual acorn. Now you will notice, if I press down, there is a bit of a buckle here. Now usually when you're working on it, you would not have a problem, but it bows outwards slightly. Just as I say, for the video, purposes of the video, I didn't want to leave it bowing out because the actual camera might end up focusing on the edge instead of focusing on this. Okay, now, because colored pencil is transparent, I must bear in mind that I need to put something light down in areas particularly that are going to be my focal point. I need to put something light down first. So it's probably a good idea to put a layer of white. Now you will find on this surface, and I'm just going to concentrate on the acorn first, Because you're working on the Clairefontaine pastel mat, you will find that your pastel that you laid in to begin with is not likely to rub off. It doesn't sort of go very far. Should you find it rubbing off, it's easy enough to reinstate it. Because you're working on the Clairefontaine pastel mat, you will find it chews your pencil points, because it is a paper that is designed for pastel, although is fabulous for colored pencil and for this particular technique. You want to get the lay-in as smooth as possible. I'm not pressing particularly hard, and I am working in a sort of a long elliptical motion. Remember, it's quite a large subject I'm doing. You don't have to blow yours up and work much larger than life size, but I just thought it would be fun to work much larger than life size. Now I'm going to turn it upside down. I like to keep the point in front of me. Look how blunt it's got already. And so by turning it upside down, I can see the point in front of me. Don't worry about that bright orange spot. It's just coincidental. It happens to be there. That's the brusher for you. It has a life of its own, and it makes all sorts of colors and spots and things where you have no idea why it's doing that. But that orange spot's going to be in my shadow area anyway, so I won't even notice it. These slight variations of color, with colored pencil being transparent, the slight variations of color that will show through your image, even when you have many, many layers on, are actually rather lovely. So the subtle, when we do our leaves, the subtle bits of green and brown and orange that will show through are actually very, very effective. So I'm getting that part in, and as I say, it's quite a dense layer. I'm particularly working carefully there, although I will be putting white here. I want to just be a bit careful I don't lose my way. Any further detailing obviously is going to develop as I go along. But this is our early stage. And it's nice when you're doing something as large as this, just to start off simply. Start off with what's going to be your focal point and just get something on the piece of paper so that you're not affected by this blank page syndrome that so often can happen. As I am looking at my acorn now, I can see I was a bit inaccurate in my transferring it down. So I'm just going to round off the shape here a bit better. And at the bottom, there is that tiny little bit on the end of the acorn. So we'll just make sure that that's filled in so that it has a reasonable shape overall. Okay, I don't want to lose that at all. So I'm just going to go in and put a bit of a dark mark or a darker mark here, just so it separates the two out. I just picked up a random brownish color. I just don't want to lose the join. You'll see now that if I put pencil over, white pencil over, you can see I've not lost it. Right, and again, just another nice smooth layer. Notice how blunt, how quickly that has become blunt. Whilst you don't need a sharp point, you do need a reasonable point so you can see where you're going. Now you could have gone in, because this paper is quite grippy, you could have gone in immediately with the acorn colouring. But I have found over the years that I do prefer to get a nice smooth layer of white down first. It just really, really does make the colour more vibrant. And particularly where you want it to be your focal point. We may not, I haven't quite decided, we may not yet do all the leaves by putting a layer of white down first. Because remember, I'm trying to think compositionally as well as technique. And I want these acorns, this acorn and this acorn cup, to be my focal point of the artwork. So perhaps it will be to my advantage to simply go in with color. But I'll think about that as I go along. Again, not wanting to lose this edge of the acorn cup, I'm just going to put a little bit of a line there so I don't lose that. Although I'm not going to put any color on that just yet. I'm going to concentrate first and foremost on my focal point here. And it's just this nice, smooth, as even as possible. You will get a little bit of inaccuracy. It doesn't matter. As even as possible, your layer of white. Now, my actual stalk here, I may not need too much white, but I think I'm going to just, so that there's a cohesiveness, I'm just going to put a tickle of lightness there so that I can actually see where I'm going. I don't lose any of the bits and the pieces. And there will be a little bit of a highlight coming through anyway. But you notice I'm working a little more gently. Right. That all looks pretty smooth. And you can see what I mean if I think about my reference. This photograph works so well because my lightest light is next to the darkest dark of the backgrounds. So the photographer was pretty good. Here I have tried to emulate similar. That is quite a dark area in my background. I can't guarantee that it was going to work because brush over has a life of its own and it just so happens. But that's why, as I showed you earlier, once your piece is dry, move your artwork that you've done on tracing paper around to see where you can get it to work. If you remember earlier, I also made mention of the fact that actually when you are using Brusho and you're preparing a whole lot of pieces of paper, it's a good idea to get into the habit of preparing 3 or 4 using similar colors, because one piece may not work that well, and in which case you can get on and use another piece. So it's always a good practice if you're going to line up all the pieces of Brusho, pieces of paper, and use Brusho on it and then allow them to dry. Do 3 or 4 in similar colors and you'll find that one piece is going to give you the effect that you want. I think whilst I am actually working this up, let me just finish this cup and put some white on it as well. You may have noticed there how the paper suddenly dipped down, right? You'll see it on the video. It's because of this buckling. But honestly, it is not a problem. Once it's mounted up, the fact that the paper actually bulges outwards makes your artwork even more three-dimensional. So it can be used to your advantage very successfully. Okay, I'm going to just do exactly the same here. Put a layer of white around this acorn cup. You may be thinking, well, why did you not just do 2 acorns? Again, simply the variety that you create when you're thinking about composition, to have 1 acorn as your main focal point, and then the cup, just to show people where it came from. It's sort of a bit subtly informative. I mean, you all know, but it's quite nice to actually see it in an artwork and not necessarily see just 2 acorns. But if you want to put 2 acorns, please feel free. Now, an ellipse is a very difficult shape to draw. So although I've whipped this up quite quickly, I may find as I go along, I am going to have to change that elliptical shape slightly. But it gives me a starting point, and that's the main thing. Right, nice layer. You can see those subtle colors coming through, but they're not bellowing. Right, and that's a good place to start laying in all the color. Now we're going to start laying in some color. going to start with the actual acorn itself here. I need to consider my light source direction. I always light my work from the left. If I'm looking at a real acorn in front of me, you will notice which part is catching the highlight. I've got it in a very similar position to the actual one I have drawn. My light is quite high up and from the left. So I'm getting a reasonably good idea as to where I want the light to catch. You can actually see the highlight. This is where it can be very, very useful, even if you work from photographic reference, to have the real thing in front of you as well, because you can often see more on the real thing than you can see from a photograph. All right, this one's got a bit dehydrated and wrinkly, so we're going to disregard that. But it gives you an idea of the highlight. So when I start off, I need to consider that. And I'm going to have my most highlighted area around about here. Now I'm going to leave it a little more generous than I need to, because I'd rather have too much highlight than not enough. So I'm going to mark where I want my highlight, and then I'm going to start to fill in some of the local color. I happen to be using a color called Dark Naples Ochre. I could go in with an ordinary yellow. However, I find that when I'm doing natural history type subjects, I actually find this Dark Naples Ochre 184 very useful. It's just slightly duller than your ordinary bright yellow. But if you only had yellow, you most certainly could use yellow. I just like this color. I might put a little yellow in later on, but at this stage I don't think I need to. Now you will notice that it's laying in quite densely. Remember, this paper has got a slight tooth. If you listen to it, you can hear that slight, although it feels reasonably smooth, when you scratch on it, you can hear a slight tooth, different to ordinary paper. And consequently, it really grips the pencil well, and it allows it to lay in quite vigorously. Many times working on this paper, you don't actually have to even burnish, but we'll talk about that a little later on. Let's just get our initial layer put in. As I work this side, I prefer to turn my work upside down. You may also notice, because of the grainy surface of this paper, that you sometimes get some pencil dust nearby. It just rubs off from the pencil. Don't worry about it unduly, but you will need to just get rid of it by either blowing it off or just tapping the paper, just so that you don't have too much floating around. You don't get much, but there may be the odd time you do get a little. You notice how the paper keeps coming up and down. Again, it's that buckling. Don't worry about it. Right, I'm using an elliptical motion. Even though I'm working really quickly, I am actually using an elliptical motion. You will notice that I've actually used the same color throughout. Even though this side is going to be my dark shadowed side, I'm still putting the same color on, because after all, the acorn is actually the same color. It just let me start again. It just means that because of my light source direction, I have got some of it in shadow. But I put the shadow on afterwards. So I want some of the local color everywhere. Now I need to crisp up my edge as well. However, I'm going to need a sharper point than that. It does blunt your pencils. So I want to have a nice crisp edge. So this is where I go in a little more carefully and just sharpen up that edge nicely, because it's my main focal point. I want it nice and crisp. And I'm putting as much oomph as I need to actually make that edge nice and crisp. Because the paper is slightly textured, you might get a slightly textured line. It doesn't matter. It'll be fine. Right, now that's my main area of highlight, but underneath this little cap part here, I want just a little bit of the local color. Now you will notice my highlight needs more white on because it was quite a shiny highlight. If I find another acorn that's not quite so crinkled, I've got a whole collection of them here. It's quite a shiny highlight. So I am going to need a little more white. So I'm going to go back with my white pencil and just put it in with a bit more oomph. And I may put it in a slightly linear fashion because I have looked at the real acorn and I've noticed that because of the slight dipping, you sometimes just get that slight linear look. So I'm going to just think about that as I put it in. So this bit in the middle is slightly dipped. I'll just tickle a little bit of my ochre through there. Now, I personally don't think that on this paper you desperately need burnishing because actually you can mix the color together simply by laying one on top of the other. If, however, you felt you wanted a burnish because the color was not laying in smoothly, you know that you can go in with your white oomph and welly and simply go over the top and mix it all together. But I don't really think it's that necessary. This is a very interesting paper, this Clairefontaine Pastel Matte. It really is an unusual paper on which to work, but it's fabulous. And the burnish does not work quite as, I don't think, as effectively, simply because you're not working at moving the pencil around. On smooth paper, you actually are almost doing that. You move the pencil around slightly. Whereas on this paper, because it has a grip, you actually don't move the pencil around that much. It also is extremely tough. And consequently, it can take numerous layers and you're not likely to make a hole through the paper, which is always useful. Right, you can see I'm going over some of the light areas a little bit, just to blend them in. Equally, I'm going back with the white and just putting a little extra on. And you will notice I've just moved the highlights. That one is slightly further down than this one. And the only reason I have done that for no other reason than it looks better. I'm just breaking up any evenness. It's an artistic decision to do that rather than what's necessarily in front of me. Just getting rid of that dust that I mentioned earlier. And you can see it's progressing along quite nicely. I'm also going to start including another color. Remember, this is my focal point. So I want to sort of zhuzh it up a little bit. And I'm just going to add something a little warmer, a little richer. It's an autumn picture, this. We want that lovely autumnal glow to come through. So now I'm working with burnt ochre. And I'm just warming up more what will be my shadow area. So I'm going in quite gently to begin with. I don't want to press too hard. And I'm just working in a long elliptical motion. And I'm just adding a little extra warmth on what will be my shadow side. I am going to put in a lot more shadow here, a lot more tonal value. But I'm just starting to think. Just adding in a few extra colors. Remember, colored pencil likes to be layered. And the more layers you are prepared to put in, actually the better. So I'm just, by tickling in this extra little bit of something, instead of it just being one color and a shadow, this should just glow through rather nicely. And it makes a subtle difference. Now, to allow a nice blend between my burnt ochre, which is slightly warmer and orangey, and my yellowy color that I put in. I'm also going to use a little bit of brown ochre. Brown ochre is a very nice yellowy brown, and just tickle, not much, not much. Do you see how that has just helped the blend between that orangey color and the yellowy color? I've just gone in with a tickle, and it just slides it, the illusion of it sliding into the other color. So it's a lovely gradual blend. I'm not pressing particularly hard, just a nice gradual blend. If I felt I needed to blend the brown ochre into the yellowy color, I would rather use the yellowy color almost as a burnishing tool. It's a bit like the technique we did on the pumpkin. For those of you who have the pumpkin video, you will find that we did not use white to burnish. We used a previously laid in color. And the technique is similar here, although you don't need much burnishing on the surface, but actually it's because you want to really keep the richness of color, particularly here where it is your focal point. Let's turn it around now and have a look and see what that's looking like. That's coming on fine. It's giving you enough interest and detail. I mustn't forget just to put a little bit of color down here on these goodies. They will go much darker, obviously. You may notice that I have left a small area almost a little bit lighter down there. That's going to end up being slightly reflected light, because of the fact I want that acorn to stand quite proud. Okay, whilst I have the brown ochre in my hand, I am also going to put a layer of brown ochre on the cup, because the cup is sort of a browny kind of color, so I need to get a little bit of something down. Now, it's not got any major highlights, but there are obviously areas of light that have to correspond with the area of light on the acorn. So I must bear in mind that this area is going to be much lighter. And it's always a good idea to mark it out. If you think you're going to forget about your lights, please make sure you mark them out. This is certainly not going to have any light showing at all, because that's going to be in the shadow. If you have a look at the real thing, I know it's not in the same position, but it gives you an idea that you can see is very shadowed because of the light source direction. We'll get onto all of that later. I just want to get a little bit of color down. So I'm not pressing very hard as yet. I'm just tickling in a little bit of color using an elliptical action, but I'm leaving that quite white at this stage. I'm not likely to leave it white all the time, but I need to remind myself, leave the lights until the bitter end before you actually do anything with them. You don't want to go and ignore your lights. Always work light through to dark, and then you're not going to lose your lights. So long ellipses here. I'm just tickling in some color. I just want to get going. Now you may think, oh my goodness, look at that. Those colors are very similar. There, those two almost disappear. Not quite. And bear in mind, this is going to be my shadow side, so it is actually going to stand up quite nicely. You'll see it. Turn it around. You will notice that this is a little uneven. That doesn't matter. I'm tickling it in quite lightly, and it doesn't matter that it looks uneven, because after all, the actual acorn cup is quite uneven. It's bumpy. So the fact that I'm already creating an unevenness here is to my advantage, and I'm not really doing anything. All it is a slight uneven layering of the white. And it just means it looks a bit different to this. Let's put a little bit here as well, just so that I have a bit of color on the paper. It's just a case of building it up and getting things going. And again, here you can see a bit of unevenness. That's fine. Right, I may need to do a little bit more defining around my actual stalks because I don't want to lose those. So I'm just going to go in with a slightly darker brown. I happen to be using something called Bister, but it really doesn't matter what you're using. You just don't want to actually lose where your stalk comes into your acorn. And there's just a slight rounding of the stalk there. There's my other stalk. So I just don't want to lose that completely when I then go and put all the colour. And don't forget, just leave that white area white at this stage, that light area white at this stage. So you can see how we're progressing along. You can put a little colour over the stalk if you will. Again, just so that you simply have something on the stalk. Let's just use brown ochre and put a little bit over it. We might bump it up with something else, but we don't want to bump it up too much because after all, it's not the focal point. And you can see the progress. We're now going to start adding some really good, strong tonal values to the actual acorn. We've got our white being our lightest light, our most highlighted area, but now we need to start adding some darks as well. I always start off with something that's dark enough to be able to be seen, and I'm going to use dark sepia. I'm working with it the other way around, so that I can keep the point in front of me so I can see exactly where I am going. Now remember, I did say earlier I want to leave a little area of reflected light. So I'm going to leave probably a more generous area than I need to begin with. I can always reduce it. Remember there was that orange spot. Well, now it's gone. You don't even notice it. So I'm going in with my dark sepia. And you may notice that actually you're starting to get quite a grainy effect. That is the texture of this paper, but don't let it worry you. It works absolutely fine. Going in with the dark sepia with a fair bit of oomph, but not too hard. Remember, the dark colors always take very easily. Now I do need to blend that. So whilst I may have a little bit of pressure here, as I work inwards, depending on the size of your work, 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, I'm just lightening the pressure and just tickling it a little more gently. I am using an elliptical motion, and I would rather stay in an area for a long time using a light pressure than pressing too hard. So I'm just getting my darkest areas in, and then we're going to work with it. This area here as well, my highlighted reflected light, I'm just going to tickle the edge, just so that there's a softening of that darkness. Now, obviously, you could have made the edge a little softer to begin with, but you do have to be aware that you must make your darks dark enough. If you are a bit wary, though, rather tickle repeatedly than go in too dark too soon and make a botch. So you can always stay in an area with only a little pressure, as I'm doing there, and just keep repeating the action round and round and round and round and round, and slowly it builds up and the dark becomes more intense. Again, you can see this graininess. It is the paper. It is as it is. From a distance, when it's hanging on a wall, you won't even notice the graininess. So don't let it stress you. I think for something like this, especially when it's obviously blown up much larger than life size, it actually just adds character more than anything else. So I want to try and blend that as carefully as I can But I'm going to put something else on top of it, and just you'll see how it will all blend together. Now I can actually also, let's just turn it the right way around, and you can see immediately the shape that it's developing. These little thingies at the bottom, I could make these a little darker, because they would pretty much be in the shadow. Now I do have to bear in mind that this cup is likely to be casting a shadow as well. So let me just turn it this way, and I want to directly underneath the cup. Just make sure my line is reasonably firm. It's not necessarily casting it all the way along, but certainly in that area it's likely to be actually casting a shadow. When you are putting in the tonal value like this, it makes you more into a thinking artist, because you actually have to think about what is it going to be doing. And with practice and working from life, or at least having the live object where possible in front of you, you do get more of an idea and a feel as to where the shadow is likely to be cast from, or what is casting the shadow. Okay, now I need to get something as an in-betweener. So I'm going in over my dark sepia with burnt sienna. Now burnt sienna is quite a nice, warm, rich brown. And remember I said to you, it's an autumny picture. We want to keep the colors nice and warm and rich. You will notice that that reflected light is far too bright. So I'm tickling a little burnt sienna into it. And I'll dull it down a little further as we go, but I still want it just a tiny bit lighter. It's going to help separate this from my leaf. And you can notice now that I'm going over with the burnt sienna, it's almost a bit like a burnish, and some of the texture from the dark sepia is lessening. I need to be careful where I join the burnt sienna to this. So I'm just going to lighten the pressure, tickle, 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 round and round in little ellipses. And you will notice it's slowly and softly blending in. When you do work in an elliptical motion, remember to change direction. So I was going this way for a while, change and go that way, for no other reason than actually it helps your blend. Some people say it prevents repetitive strain injury, which I suppose is a valid point. I don't find that's too much of a problem, but I suppose it is a valid point. I just find optically it actually gives me a better blend. Same thing here, make sure that that's nicely blended in. Soft tickle as I get into the lighter areas, and I'm going to blend that further. The technique is just a little different to working on ordinary smooth paper. And obviously it becomes individual. What you see in front of you must make you as the artist happy. Right, coming up here, just pulling that in. Notice how I've deliberately made a little bit of a line there. Remember my somewhat dehydrated acorn, it is a bit linear. So whilst I do not want to emphasize that fact, there's no harm in just showing that I have an understanding of the subject by tickling in a little bit of a line. And same thing here, just around the edge there, softening it. I need quite a nice blend here. I'm keeping the pencil quite still. Notice this oblique angle that I have developed. By keeping the pencil still and the slightly rough texture of the paper allows me to develop this oblique angle quite quickly. Right, hang on, let's turn it the right way around so you can see what you're looking at. And that's looking quite good already. Now I'm going to go in with one of the previously laid in colors, which was my burnt ochre, and using the technique that was done on the pumpkins. Same thing, I'm just going to use the burnt ochre to help almost burnish that in. I'm also going to just use the burnt ochre very slightly on this edge here. It just looked a bit unfinished. For no other reason, you really need to get into the habit of constantly looking at your own artwork in front of you and saying, does that look right? And if it does, that's wonderful. If it doesn't, then it gives you an opportunity to do something about it. So I'm just on the edge where the burnt sienna is and has been laid down. I'm using the burnt ochre as a sort of a burnishing tool and just running a little bit over to keep the burnt sienna nicely blended. It needs to optically blend, but do remember this is a different surface and is going to react just slightly differently. I'm also going to use the burnt sienna in this reflected light because I don't want the reflected light to be too bright. Notice how I twisted the pencil. I have now suddenly a sharp point in front of me, and I can go over the reflected light area with as much pressure or otherwise as I feel I need, just to create a slight lightening. I'll turn it the right way in a minute and you'll be able to see exactly what I mean. The reflected light needs to be subtle. It doesn't need to be a huge feature, but I think it looks better there. Let's turn it around. And you can see that that reflected light is quite subtle. I may or may not, as I work my way around and through the leaf, adjust it. If you look at the reference, there's no reflected light. The darkest dark is right on the edge. That's fine. That's what the photographer wanted. The darks here have a tendency to run into each other. Because I want my acorn to be a little bit more of a focal point, I don't want them to run into each other. And by leaving that little bit of reflected light, once I have built up the leaf, I'm going to be able to separate the acorn out, visually separate the acorn out from the leaf, for no other reason than I think it would probably look better. We're going to continue working up the acorns to completion. You will notice that I have put a little colour on the acorn cup at the top. We're going to continue finishing that, and then we're going to do this one. I deliberately didn't show you that one because if you notice, I'm now going to just hold this live specimen. There's actually very little detail showing here because it's very, very shadowed. There's more showing there, so we're going to concentrate on the technique there. This, as long as you can see it's not an even laying of color and it's a bit sort of hit and miss here and there, that will do. Right, we want to finish the rest of the cup because that actually is quite important as far as tonal value goes. So you want to think it through exactly where the light is hitting and where it's not hitting. We need a bit more of something on there. I put a layer of white to begin with, if you remember. I think I'm now going to go in with one of the warm greys. This is probably warm grey 3, and I'm just going to add another layer because the inside of the cup is not particularly bright. So I'm just going to add another layer of something else over the white just to dull it down a little bit. I don't want that to be too light and pop forward in any particular way. However, as I am going along, you'll notice I'm just using that long elliptical motion, working quite quickly, but just laying it in, thinking about the shape of the actual cup as well. And as I'm going along, I must remember this little inner bit. So I must just think whereabouts that would fit. Here is the bottom stalk, and so I need to make sure I don't cover over it completely because it is somewhat paler. So I'm just going to go around like that and see if that looks okay. I'd rather leave it too large than not large enough. I can always reduce it into size as I go. Remember, elliptical shapes when you are drawing them are actually quite challenging. Right, that'll do at this stage, I'm quite sure. So I just want to put a layer of this warm grey. The pencil is so short I couldn't tell you what number it is. I think it's warm grey 3. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's warm grey 3. Just all over. To dull it down, I don't want the white yelling at me. Doesn't matter if it's a bit uneven. We've got quite a number of layers to still put on, so it really doesn't matter. It's just to get it dull. Now, if you have a look at the reference I am holding next to me, it's also got a certain amount of brown in it, changing the direction in which I am working. Right, I'm now going to put in a little raw umber, because I don't want anything too bright, just to have that slight brownish tinge. So just a smidgen of raw umber, and you can see again I'm using that long elliptical motion, and I'm just browning it a little bit, changing the direction in which I am working. So I'm going this way to begin with, anti-clockwise, then all of a sudden change it to clockwise. I find it really does lay in the color a bit better if you are changing direction. But it becomes a personal thing. It honestly is up to you. Right, so I think I'm achieving a reasonably good color match looking at that. Now I need to consider where these two things meet, what I'm actually going to do. We'll worry about that little ellipse thingy at the bottom in a minute. I'm just thinking basic color to begin with. I'm not thinking tonal value just yet. It's only my local color. You have to bear in mind that the whole thing is the same color, although you can actually see shadow in it. That's exactly what you can see. You're seeing shadow, you're not seeing a change of color. And so that is something that is worthwhile considering whenever you are drawing anything. Do make sure you've got a layer of local color underneath before you actually put in the tonal value. Right, that's looking quite good. I think another little bit of gray over the top will probably just pull it all together. Now I'm almost using the gray as a burnish. When we did the pumpkin exercise, for those of you who did the pumpkin exercise, we spoke about, instead of burnishing with white or ivory or one of the grays, we spoke about burnishing with a previously laid in color. Now that's exactly what I'm doing. I am burnishing with a previously laid in color. I had gray down and then I put the raw umber, and now I'm using the gray again, just to kind of smooth things out. The inside of that is quite smooth. Now you may be looking at it and thinking, well, what about all those little spots or speckles that you can see? I will perhaps put those in later. Why I say perhaps is because you don't want it to be distracting. So I may put them in, but I may put them in slightly more subtly than what you can initially see them. Now I have to consider, as I'm coming up here, this is where these two join, same as down here, and I'm going to show you what I'll do in just a minute. Right, so I'm pressing reasonably firmly, and you can see now that that has smoothed things out, and it's given me a pretty good tonal, well, no, sorry, a pretty good basic layer. I now want to think a little bit tonally. So I need to consider that around the edge here, although it is not very thick, it does have a certain amount of thickness. And if you look at it this way, you can just carefully see a little bit of lightness on the edge. So to separate this from that, I am going to just add a little lightness, but I'm not going to do it yet on this side. I am going to do it on that side. You'll understand why in a minute. So I'm just going to just reinforce that little bit of lightness and tickle it downwards a smidgen. I happen to be using ivory because I just want to keep the color quite warm. I could use white or I could use a paler gray, but I think the ivory just works. And you can see I'm just tickling it in a little bit, just as I go along, just to define that edge slightly. It doesn't have to be desperately crisp yet. You'll understand why in a second or two. Right, and you can see I've gone around the edge and I've just tickled it down a weeny bit, so it's not a straight line. Okay, so before we go too much further, we need to consider this elliptical thingy in the middle. If I look at mine, I actually think I need to just change the shape slightly. Now I'm going in with the raw umber and a bit of a broken line. Whoops. I think that will do. It's not absolutely even. It's slightly uneven if I look at the center there. Now the color is similar, but a little paler. So I'm going to put a smidgen of this brown over it. And again, the same lay and stroke. Now the reason I can do this reasonably speedily is because, remember, I'm working really large. Compare that life size to this that I am drawing. It is particularly large. Right, and then I'm going to put a little ivory over the top. Instead of using the grey as I did there, I'm going to put a little ivory over the top, because actually it's just slightly paler in colour and in tone. Okay, and then it's got some little sort of bumpy things, well, little spots. Let me just use something a tiny bit darker. Let's see if that'll work. And it is quite a feature, the slight texture. I suppose it's sort of a part of the actual acorn. That's how it kind of sticks on. Not that I'm any expert on acorns. Right, and the inside has got a little bit of sort of unevenness of colour, which I'll just tickle in. I'm going for a fair amount of believable detail, but as you can see, I'm not working necessarily in a very exacting fashion, but it certainly will look believable once I get the tonal value in. Now I'm going to start thinking about the tonal value. I'm going to go in with my dark sepia because I want something dark enough. If you have a look, remember my light is upper left, which is generally considered, if you're a right-handed artist, the best direction in which to light your work if you're going to be working from life. And if you have a look at the real object, and this is where it's particularly helpful to have the real object, even if you're working from photographic reference, having the real object in front of you gives you a better understanding of what you are actually drawing. And you can see quite clearly that the light is hitting there mostly, whereas all this is pretty shadowed. So I need to consider that, and I'm going to start tickling in little ellipses. Now I'm working a little more precisely, so I want to keep my ellipses a little more organized and controlled. Tickling in enough dark, I'm leaving this slightly light edge here. At the moment, you'll see why and how it all pulls together. Right, so little ellipses this way and that way. Remember, I change direction. And I'm looking now mainly for the shadow. I don't want to really look for much else. I want to look, where is the shadow lightest? Where is it darkest? As it works its way up here, I'm just looking at the top ridge here, it gets somewhat more gentle and it starts to blend into the local color. Down the bottom here, there's a bit more oomph, and I will put still a little more oomph, but I would rather do it gently. You may notice on this particular paper, I'm getting quite a lot of graininess. That's absolutely fine. It is because the Clairefontaine paper has got that natural tooth. Now, as I put some dark sepia over here, because that part has still got a little bit of shadow, I may lose some of the detailing. If I do, I'm just going to tickle a little more dark sepia over the detailing, just with a tiny bit more pressure so I don't lose it completely. Just a tickle more. Right? Now I'm going to just refine it. I need a bit more dark here. So I'm just pressing a tiny bit harder. And I'm just putting in a bit more dark. I'm going to just turn the paper around because I need to get this point in front of me now so I can actually see what I am doing here. I need to start crisping up this edge slightly. When you do press a little harder on the surface, remember you may get little bits, in which case I just blow them away. So don't be afraid of putting in your darks with a bit of oomph. You can see immediately now that slight lightness that I left there is just making it a bit more obvious, that edge. So I'm separating out this from this only by tonal value. I'm allowing the light to appear lighter because I am darkening the dark. Now, if you look particularly closely at an acorn cup, you will notice there appear to be little, you can't really see it, I'm sorry, but you need to go and get an acorn cup and look closely, almost like little teeth, which when it lets the acorn go and this opens up, you can just see the remnants thereof. So I want to just consider that, and I'm going to reinforce it as I go along. And just every so often, I'm just making the illusion of those little teeth. Right, I want just a little more dark there. Do you see how I've got the slight sort of scalloping almost? It's not 100% even because after all we are drawing, you know, a piece of nature. It's not always 100% even. But you can see now that slight variation. Okay, now because I have gone and put some dark in, I need to consider that I should put a little bit of a mini burnish to help that blend in. Let me just double check myself and see where else I may want a little bit of dark. There is a tiny bit up here. Not much, it's just a smidgen. The light is sort of hitting here, but it's hitting more the inside than the outside. I'll just go around there a little bit. I do need that to be my main area of light. So I'm just looking at everything and just deciding, does it look balanced? This is where you as an artist make these decisions. You have the object in front of you or the photographic reference or whatever. The viewer of your artwork at the end does not. So you can actually make the decisions where you are going to make the viewer look. So I'm just going to put a little extra tonal value down here, shadow part of the tonal value, because I think it'll show off this edge better as I go along. But it's not going to be as hard or as firm as this, which is definitely my more shadowed side. If you have a look at that now, that already is starting to get a pretty good shape. Because the whole trick is to try and make an object which is two-dimensional look three-dimensional. Now, again, remember the rule was when you put something down, you may or may not need a mini burnish to help blend it in. So I am going to, on this area, maybe not the dark, but on this area, I'm going to go in with some more of my gray. Remember, that was one of the previously laid in colors. And I'm just doing a bit of a mini burnish over the top. And you can see it just helps soften it all down and blend it in. Right here as well, just softens it all down and blends it in. So I get a softer look. I think I need a little bit more dark on some of these marks, because now that I've got this dark tone, those look a little bit pale. I'm just going to go in with a smidgen of dark sepia and just tickle the odd little bit here or there. Just a little bit, just to bump them up, and some of the markings that were at the bottom here. And I think that looks better. Now I'm going to go back with my ivory. And I'm just going to, oh dear, it's rather a sick looking pencil. I think my ivory won't be being used. You occasionally get pencils that just crumble and go horrible. You can see it. It's got funny marks on it. And generally it seems to be the ivories or the grey. Let me just try a small sharpener and see if I can get a point to it. That's better. I can go in with my ivory. Okay, and I'm just going to define this edge here, bearing in mind that it has those little teeth that I mentioned to you. So just, it doesn't have to be overdone, but just every so often, the thought of a little tooth just adds that small amount of accuracy, so that anybody who is looking at the artwork from a slightly more botanical perspective, as opposed to just a decorative perspective, can see that as an artist, I have looked carefully at my subject matter. Now, neither way is right or wrong. That's why there is such a thing called botanical art. It's art. It's how you actually want to interpret it as a viewer. You either interpret it from a very botanical perspective or you interpret it from an artistic perspective, and it becomes individual. Now I'm going to do exactly the same on that edge there. I am aware that when I do the leaf behind, I may need to reinstate it, but I can worry about that later. It's small little marks. It's not huge marks because those little teeth are not huge, but they are there. And you can see as I'm going along, I'm just showing the viewer that I am aware that there is something a bit more. It's not an absolutely smooth cup. So it's all down to observation. But it is a personal thing. You do not have to show it. You can interpret your own artwork as an artist in a slightly more decorative fashion. I mean, this is basically decorative because no traditional botanical work has a brush-out background. But it doesn't stop you from putting in the odd little surprising bit of accuracy. Right, and I think I just need a tiny smidgen more brown. That white just looked a little bit too white, so I'm just going to go up to it a bit with just a little bit more brown. And this is where you always make adjustments as you go along. Just because you decide on one course and one lot of colors does not mean that you don't have to change. You can if you want to. Entirely up to you. Now I think that gives me a reasonably believable inner cup. Let's have a look at this and think about this one. Now this one, because I haven't got any fresh acorns, I'm kind of looking actually at my reference quite a bit. Now it's got a lot of texture on it, and one thing you want to bear in mind when you are doing something like this, don't be blinded by the texture. Look first for the tonal value. And you will notice, obviously, that's the shadow side. That's easy enough to see. But it actually curves down. So there is slightly more tonal value there at the bottom as the acorn curves. So you do need to consider that. I need to put a bit more color on here because that's not quite sufficient. So I'm going to I'll put a layer of raw umber on. Again, elliptical motion, just another layer. You notice I have thought where my lightest light is, and I'm going to leave that as is at the moment because I'd rather have it too light than not light enough. So I'm just going in with an extra layer. Now you also notice that I have my reflected light there to pretty much mirror what I have down here. However, at the top there I showed no reflected light. I'm not sure what I'm going to do there. I may take away that reflective light. it may not be necessary. And after all, it's a completely different texture to the actual acorn, which is smooth and shiny. So I could possibly do away with it, but that might look weird. So we'll just wait. And this is exactly what I mean when you are doing a work as an artist. Change your mind as you go along. Be flexible. Nothing is absolutely set in stone. Right, I'll put a little brown over that, but soft pressure, because I don't want to lose it. Right, I'm going to go back and just put a little bit of extra ivory over what I know is going to be my light side, just so I've got a good dense layer on the paper. Right, that's looking good. Now I'm going to start thinking tonally straight away. I'm not thinking pattern and texture. I like to make sure I don't forget my tonal value. So to make it easier, I'm going to start on my shadow side and then I'm going to work my way along. That tonally is darker than this. So I may even need to bump up the tonal value there as I add it here. Again, working in an elliptical motion. And you can change direction, obviously, this way, that way. I can turn it upside down this way as well. Whatever you find more comfortable. I like to keep my hand still and move the paper, but that's my personal choice. Right, I'm just going to bump up the tone there a little bit. Many times when you start to add tonal value onto other areas, you will notice you need to strengthen that which you have already done. So I'm just going to go round and round and round here. I'm not pressing particularly hard. I'm just building up my tonal value. I know exactly that this is my shadow side because of the fact I know where my light is coming from, and the fact I've done that helps. So I'm leaving that reflected light at the moment because I may need it. It's always easy enough to darken it and take it away if you think it would look better, but at this stage I think I probably will leave it. Right, as I get towards my lighter side, remember there's my greatest area of highlight, I want to just press a little more gently, softly, 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 so that it blends. And that's always quite important. Try not to create hard edges, because with colored pencil, hard edges are quite a challenge to blend away. Here you can see as I'm going round and round and round, gently, 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 it's just blending into the brown with very little effort. Now that, to be fair, does take quite a lot of practice. So don't be too hard on yourself if you can't achieve it immediately. Now remember I said the bottom here needs some tonal value. And by putting in this extra little bit of tonal value down here, it's going to make my light area there look even lighter. It's quite an interesting optical illusion. I've not done anything to that, but it will make it look lighter. And again, it's about the blending. That I need slightly lighter than this. So I'm just going round and round and round. Gently, gently, gently blending it in. Now I need to actually put some of the local color on. I'm not going with anything particularly bright or cheerful. I think my raw umber will do. I might even, however, tickle in a little green gold, just around the lightest area. And this is where there's no right or wrong as far as the colors you use go. You must use what you feel suits your subject. Just because I'm using these does not mean you have to use the same. You could be doing a completely different colored acorn. It might be much greener than mine is, and in which case, go with it. Right, so I'm just going in there, quite precise near the edge there. And I'm pressing as firmly or not as I need to. This is again pretty much that technique of almost giving a burnish with a previously laid in color. I have previously laid in raw umber, then I put dark sepia, and now I'm using the raw umber over the dark sepia to almost burnish it together. I just need that small little bit of reflected light there, which disappears when I get to the actual acorn, the other side. Turning it around as suits you. And the same thing, I'm going to have that little bit of reflected light, but I need to reduce it just slightly because it's a bit too bright. And I need to do a bit more blending there, which I will get onto. And you can see how that is blending together rather nicely. Pressing as hard or as gently as you need to. It's very important with colored pencil to have good pencil control, and it comes with practice. Some people find it very easy, some people find it quite challenging, but really and truly it's just practice. Here I want a gentle, gentle blend. I don't mind the odd little bump of texture coming through. After all, we're going to make that quite bumpy just now anyway. And already you can see it's taking shape. That is what tonal value is all about. I can't emphasize it enough. I'm quite boring. I'm a bit like a stuck record. You really, really do need your darks and your lights. They make your life so much easier in the long run. Okay, now I need to do something about those very bright reflected light areas here. I'll put a bit of brown on them because that's going to help when I go in with a little bit of ivory. Let me use this small sharpener because the other one is chomping it. And I just want to gently, gently blend that down. So I have got my little bit of reflected light, but it's not too bright. I know that main acorn is my focal point, so I have got room to tweak up brighter areas and lighter areas, but in the same way I don't want it to look too odd. So you can see I'm working in quite a wiggly fashion. I'm not blending smoothly. This is going to end up being very textured, so I'm already thinking along those lines and doing my blend in a sort of a wiggly fashion. Be flexible when you are working. Don't think it's only one way suits all. Everybody is so individual. You need to be flexible. You can see that's working quite nicely, and it's not even got any texture on. I just need to do something with these horrible white marks I've made here. Easy enough to get rid of, particularly on this paper. Remember, this particular paper, the Clairefontaine Pastel Matte, is incredibly flexible. And because of its rather grippy surface, it will take the pencil endlessly. And you can see how easy it was to get rid of those marks. I don't want it too bright though, so I'll just put a smidgen of brown over it as well. That, of course, will be casting a shadow, but I'm not even thinking about that just yet. Right, I need to just stop and look and say, well, tonally, how is it looking? And I think at the moment, tonally, that is looking fine. Now I need to develop the texture. Now we're going to do the detailing and the texture on the cup of the acorn. I'm going to be working with dark sepia, and I would rather press a little harder at times and a little more gently at other times. I just find that easier. Now the cup is actually quite a textured item, but it's quite challenging to see exactly what is happening. What gives it that texture? It almost looks a little like those kind of shapes if you look closely. Now you don't want to be too regimented if you are to put those shapes in, so you've got to be a bit careful about that. It's difficult to see from the photograph, and this is where, as I say, often working from life helps you, but it's actually difficult to see from life because it's really quite tiny. But it does appear to be, and they point that way, that sort of shape. So with that in mind, that's what I'm going to consider. I'm going to turn it the other way around because I just think it's going to look a little bit better. And I'm going to start just randomly putting in these kind of triangle type shapes in places. I'm working with quite a blunt point because I'm not going for sharp, crisp detail, but I am going for a fair, reasonably detailed or accurate kind of effect. So I'm putting in these random triangular sort of shapes. Remember, as I get towards the lighter side, I must press a little more gently. I don't want these sort of sharp shapes to take over and be too dominant. So I'm just putting them in. Obviously, if you were working life size, they are really, really tiny. Here I have a little more flexibility because of the fact that I am working so large. Now, they may look a little odd to begin with, but I'm just putting the thought in so that I can then add a little more tonal value as I go along. If you had magnifying glasses and so on and so forth, you would probably find that you could do it a little more accurately. And that, again, depends entirely on you and your individual approach. Now, I must be careful as I work here. I do not press too hard. But I still prefer to actually work with the dark sepia. I'm allowing these here. You notice I'm starting to get quite a blunt pencil now, to actually be a bit more diffuse. In the highlighted area, I'm not emphasizing that triangular shape. It is sort of there, as you can see, but it's just a bit more diffuse. I'm pressing very gently. I want my highlight to still show through, and I obviously can't have this shape dominating because it's going to look weird. So the thought is there, and I've done it there with a little more detail, but as I work my way through here, it's just that little bit more gentle. We'll turn it around just now so we can have a look at it and see what it kind of looks like. Yep, that'll do fine, because now I need to increase the tonal value. I need to think about these little shapes. They sort of stick out a bit if I'm looking at the real thing. And consequently, they kind of catch the light, but underneath they're casting a shadow. So I'm still not working with a particularly sharp point because I do not want it very crisp. So they're casting a bit of a shadow underneath, but they themselves are inclined to stick out slightly, going by the real object. In the shadow side, it's going to be a lot easier because you aren't going to see as much detail. So it's quite nice to start in the shadow side because of the fact it gives you room to practice. So remember, these stick out. Let's go to one that's reasonably clear to see. That is the shape, and these bits stick out, but they cast a bit of a shadow underneath. And obviously more to one side because of where my light source is coming from. And this is what creates this rather uneven sort of finish. Again, I'm pressing quite gently at this stage. There will be places I'm going to tweak up the texture, but at this stage I'm going quite gently, because I can then more easily make alterations should I need to. So as I'm going through here, notice my pencil point is still relatively blunt because I do not want anything terribly, terribly crisp. If I was doing this as a very, very detailed botanical study, I would have to be working with a magnifying glass and/or goggles or whatever. Here I must be careful. In fact, here I think, as much as I want my darks in, I think I would be better off changing to a lighter brown. This I happen to be one is Bista. Gives me just enough dark. I don't want to lose my light areas, but it does allow me to cast this little bit of shadow underneath the sticky out point thing that I've been busy drawing. So I just keep working my way along. I may go in with a bit of dark sepia at the bottom, but in my very highlighted area, I'm doing the same thing, but I'm not using dark sepia. It would be too strong. Right, I think now I can go in with a little dark sepia at the top here, where it's a little bit darker. I don't know how I got that dark mark. I'll just extend it a bit and put a bit of ivory over it. Remember, I am still going to cast a shadow. So down here, I could just tweak up the odd little bit of shadow because it is slightly more shadowed down there anyway. So I could just tweak up a little bit. As you go along, whilst you're not wanting to lose that area of light, remember we can get a little bit of it back because of the fact that we're working on this paper. As we go along, I can now just increase a little bit of extra dark. And what I'm doing is I'm actually, although I'm creating this texture, I'm looking at what's in front of me. And I'm thinking, well, actually, as an artwork, is this now working? It may not be 100% botanically accurate, but it is reasonably, because I have looked as carefully as I can and decided why I've got this strange shape, what it is, what's casting this kind of shape. And when I say what's casting, what shadows are being cast by that kind of pointy overlapping, almost ridge tiles. So I'm just pressing a tiny bit harder in places, particularly towards my shadow side, because I think I need a bit more of the point. That was getting a bit too blunt. Whoops. And you press as firmly or otherwise as you need to achieve the result you want to achieve. Now that is looking particularly light again. Remember, I spoke about it earlier. The darker you make your darks, the lighter your lights look. It's that rather peculiar illusion that just happens. So just keep working it up a little bit more. Let me just turn it upside down so I can just add a little extra oomph and welly. Then I'm going to go in with something a bit lighter because I just want to blend that in slightly. I think I'm going to use this green gold. Let's just see what that looks like. Just every so often give the illusion of the light catching one of those tips. It's more about an optical blend. And I think that will be dark enough. Maybe I just need to darken it a bit more. That looks better. And I'm just toning down that lightness. But I'm just thinking, well, the light might just be very subtly capturing one of these sort of sticky out bits. Let's turn it back again and see if that looks better. I think it does. We'll just go over it with a little bit of brown. You have to be patient with something like this. You may have to go back and forth a number of times to get the illusion to work. There's no absolute right and wrong. I don't want to lose my slight subtle lightness there. It looked a bit bright, but I think it was because the line was a bit straight perhaps. Here I also want just this little bit of light that's catching, almost reflecting off parts of this, just to come up slightly so that it doesn't look like a straight line. Here as I go along, again, I can just catch a little bit of light on some of these sticky out bits. Here we can kind of smooth them down a little bit because this is my most highlighted area. The detailing is not quite as obvious. And we'll go in with a little extra brown as an in-between. If you get your basic shaping quite accurate to begin with, it then allows you, because colored pencil is transparent, it allows you to almost work over it in a random kind of way, which disguises things to a degree and makes it look better. And when you are working over it, maybe with another color, press in varying degrees of intensity. Some places you will press with a fair bit of oomph, and then there's other places you will not press quite as vigorously. You can change direction if it looks better. It's all about what you are actually creating in front of you. So there's not a definite right or wrong. It's as I'm looking at it, I think that looks better. Those were looking a little too sharp, but I needed them there because it gave me an understanding of what it was I was actually drawing. I think as a textured acorn cup on an artwork that's not designed to be hyper-realistic, I think that's probably pretty accurate and will certainly do the job. I can just tweak up the odd little bit here and there. I've got to think that it would possibly be casting a shadow, definitely would be casting a shadow. So here, this little bit down here, again, it's just a bit of a wash, for want of a better word, with the dark sepia. Thinking that the light is coming, there would be a bit of a shadow being cast here just to darken that slightly. Now, you don't have to put in cast shadows if you don't want to. I just, where appropriate, think it's quite nice to put them in, but it's certainly just a personal choice. There's nothing sort of urgent about having to put them in. So I think that little bit that I did there is just enough to show. And on this branch too, the branch was done very simply, but that I think would probably also actually be darker rather than lighter. I don't need to go dark. The branch is not the focal point. Remember, you ought to think where out of all of this is the focal point. Perhaps a little bit of light is being caught there. So let's have a look now and have a look at our acorn and see whether that all sort of works together. So far, I think that's fine. One thing that is grabbing my eye is this light bit there. For some reason, I don't like it. So I'll just use some of the darker grey and just push it back a little bit. It just looked a little too obvious. This is what I mean. You need to be flexible. You need to look at your work and say, is it working? Can I change it? And so on. That is the technique that I have used for my acorn and my acorn cup, because that area is my focal point. I am now going to start laying in the pencil on my leaves. But what I have to start thinking about now to make my artwork a bit more exciting is actual perspective. All my leaves are behind my focal point. So I am not going to put a layer of white. If you remember here, I put a layer of white first to allow it to pop forward on the colored background. Now I am not going to put a layer of white. I'm going to start putting in my color just directly on the paper. So I am allowing a little bit of the colors of the background to show through. And I'm just going to put it in quite gently. There's a lot of layers that are going to go on it, but quite gently and smoothly. What may be helpful to you is to put in your veins. Now, the joy of working on leaves that have lost their sap is that there's not a huge difference between back and front. There is a bit of a one, but because the leaves don't have any sap in them, the veins don't stand particularly proud and consequently cast shadows. So you don't have to worry too much. And the veins are all sort of brownish as opposed to being pale in color. So going in with your average kind of brown will do just fine. And from the stalk here, remember, I don't want to put any white underneath because I don't want my leaves to pop. That I want to pop. You will see as I go along the difference it's going to make. And then slowly I will simply work my vein in. You can hardly see it, but you will see it as you work your way along. So I'm just going to get those in. Odd one coming out here. And then I want a layer. You can change color as you go along. I like to just simply get a layer down. I'm using this rather lovely color called green gold. And I think it just works very nicely on these leaves. If you find you are losing an edge slightly, I've just tickled in a smidgen of ivory over the top. So if I think it's going to disappear, I'm just going to put in this tiny little smidgen of ivory so I can see where I'm going more than anything. And you just want to start by putting in this nice layer. You don't have to use green gold. I just like it. Notice how you can see the color of the background coming through. Now, although we have lots more layers to put on top, because I am not putting that layer of white, this is just the shape of my leaf. Because I'm not putting that layer of white, it's going to be just subtly muted as I start to build it up. I'm working in quite a long linear stroke because I just want to get a layer down. Now I can change as I go along, but I would prefer to have one color down first, and then I'm going to change as I build up the intensity and interest of the leaf. And I also have to bear in mind, out of the leaves that I have on my paper, even those leaves need to have focal point. Well, not focal point, they need to have perspective. So this one is probably going to be a mid-ground one because it's pretty close to my acorn. So I'm going to consider this as sort of a middle ground one. That one there, I will probably consider almost foreground, but it's not going to be quite as sharp as this one. That I'm going to consider to be a background leaf. And you'll see as we go along and build it up. But my initial is just laying in this layer of green gold. And as I say, we'll develop all the interesting colors as we progress. Notice how quickly this paper chews through a pencil point. It's not worrying me particularly because I'm just wanting to get a layer on. I quite enjoy this stage where you're not met with this blank page syndrome. You're not thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with my leaf? Just get a layer on. It's a good place to start. Then we can start doing all the interesting colors and different things. Again, it's quite useful to have real leaves in front of you. I did rescue some from the rain the other day and consequently now have them. They've still got a little bit of interesting color. There is a little bit of green coming through in places. Some of them are really brown and curly, back and front, as you will. But there's some interesting colors, which again, you know how variable they can be. You can exaggerate or not, but I'm not going to exaggerate them too much because here's my focal point, not my leaf. If I was doing a different study where the leaf was a focal point, then that would be a completely different approach. It would be very much more like that approach. And so you're going to progress on getting a layer of something on all of your leaves. Then we're going to start working them up. We're going to concentrate on the leaves now. The whole time we have to bear in mind that the leaf mustn't become the focal point. So as you can see here, I have started to lay in a little bit of extra color. I'm not pressing particularly hard, and I'm just using random autumny colors, entirely up to you what you use. I'm using a little bit of green in places as well, but I'm just laying in basic color. I'm allowing the colors that are underneath to show through, and yet I'm still putting a decent enough amount on the paper. So you may want to tickle in a little bit of orange. As I say, whatever random colors suit you and suit your leaf, up to you entirely. But don't press too hard. Try and allow some of the color from underneath to show through. As you can see here, this orange stripe, eventually it's not going to be that obvious, but you want to let a little bit show through, or I think it would be advisable to let a little show through. What I'm also not doing, although my outline is pretty good and accurate, I'm not particularly working towards a very crisp outline. I don't want anything that's terribly crisp. Obviously it needs to be even enough you can see where you're going. You still want the detail when you're doing something like this. So you still want detailing, but you don't want it quite as detailed and crisp as your actual focal point. I'm not worrying at this stage about tonal value. I'm simply laying in the color. As I look down here, I think I've missed out a bit of leaf, so we'll just add in a little bit of extra there. Just thinking about the overall shape. And quite gently. You can still see the vein that I filled in. Let's add a little bit of something else. This area down here, although in theory it might be a little closer to me than that area up there, so if I'm thinking from a perspective point of view, I could make it crisper if I wanted to, because as it becomes closer to me, I could actually make it more detailed, but I don't. As it goes to the end of the paper here, I actually prefer it to just almost fade away. We will put in sufficient detail, but at this stage, I don't want anything too detailed. I just want to get a layer on the paper. Let's put in a little green as well, I think. Just there. And I'm deliberately putting a little green here because it's going to help set off the warm colors of the acorn. And this is where it's rather nice as an artist. You can decide where you want to put in extra color. No one is going to see the leaf. That will have long since gone off into the garden compost. They will be looking at your artwork and not at the leaf. And you can see how adding that little bit of green just helps complement the fact that there's green in the background as well. Right, and I'm going to do pretty much the same thing on the other two leaves as well. The only difference is I want to consider perspective. I want to consider which leaf is going to come forward, which leaf is going to go back. Now, this one, I've done it first because it happens to be the main leaf in the picture, but that's actually my mid-ground leaf. I don't want it as crisp as that. This leaf up here, I am actually going to consider my foreground leaf. So it's going to be on the same level, perspective-wise, as my acorn, but because it's that much smaller, it's not going to dominate. This leaf here is going to be a background leaf, and consequently, although I'm going to do it exactly the same way to begin with, I'm going to lay in the color even more gently. And you can see already my first layer is on. It's very much softer. All I'm doing is altering the pressure. I'm using the same colors. I'm not changing anything else, but I'm simply altering the pressure with altering the pressure of the pencil on the paper. So I can add my bits of orange as I did on this one, but it's just that much more gentle. I'm really working at allowing the color of the paper to show through. So the whole time I'm just thinking this is going to be a background leaf. I do not want it as strong in intensity or color or anything. I'm deliberately lessening it. And this is part of an artist's decision. I mean, I still want to be able to see it, so I will tweak in. I'm looking sort of almost tonally at it and saying, well, this is pretty orange next to orange. I do need to just see a little bit. And I am aware that I am going to be putting tonal value on, which will strengthen it anyway. But I also want to keep it quite gentle. Not much detail. Very, very soft lay-in. And you can see this green is now just picking up the green that's in the background. Obviously, you can change the color of your leaves. If I look at my photographic reference, the leaves here happen to be quite green. I don't want them particularly green. I'm looking at my real leaves that I have here, which are lovely and brown, but there's the odd one that still has a little green in it. So I'm working more on the coloring of that. I want to keep the whole finished artwork quite autumnal. I don't mind the little bit of green that's coming through in the background. I put it there. So that's absolutely fine. But the thought of the artwork is basically quite a warm, autumnal type colouring. So I'm just gently laying it in. And you can see there's now a little more definition, but not much. I really don't want to work up too much definition in that background leaf. This leaf I can lay in with a little more precision. Let's have a look and see. I'm sticking with basically this yellowy color as a sort of a base layer underneath all the leaves. And then I'm adding on top of it, and then we'll think tonal value and so on and so forth. So let me just put a little bit of orange up there, because I think that will show up quite nicely. And then I want to think a little more detail here and there. I'm deliberately going to make this edge of the leaf a little orangier because it's against the green. And if this is going to be basically a foreground leaf, I want just a little bit more jumping off the page. Obviously, it's a well-folded leaf. You can only see the top part there. Again, I didn't want to have a flat leaf like this because of the fact that although this is foreground, I don't want it to be focal point. So now I need to think everything through. Okay, so now I've got a fair bit of color on. I may add a little bit more as I go along. What I'm going to do on that particular leaf is I'm going to start considering tonal value, because that is what is going to make it pop forward a little bit more. Oh dear, sorry, I shouldn't have used that sharpener for this pencil. It's taking exception to it. That's better. So I know that if my light is coming from my upper left, this part is certainly going to be highlighted. So I'm going to go in with my ivory and I'm just going to bump it up. As soon as you add some extra lights, it just pops it a little bit more. And then I'll blend it down a bit. Now I'm going to add other colors. Here is one of the veins. I may now need to just strengthen it slightly. You cannot see the mid vein because actually the mid vein is running along the top here. So that'll do. It just fills it out a little more. Obviously, there are lots of other veins that come out, but they're not particularly noticeable when they don't have sap in them. But they still can cast a little bit of a shadow and create a little bit of extra tonal value. So what this one does, and I'm not going in terribly dark, what this one will probably do is, because the vein is there and you may think I've kind of lost it, but it just comes with experience. You sort of know where these things go. There might be a little more tonal value on this side. So here's my vein, and there might just be a little smidgen of extra tonal value there, because these leaves are still attached to the tree slightly. Again, I'm using my dark sepia simply because I often prefer working with a slightly darker color and less pressure. But it becomes a personal thing. That's my vein running there, but I don't really want a dark on each side of it, because if I do that, it straight away turns it to the back of the leaf, which is quite a challenge. But we don't have to worry about that here. Right, I'm going to have a little bit of a dip here. So I'm thinking now, where would the light be catching? Where would it not be catching? There's possibly a little bit of darkness coming up there. And all this does is just simply add interest to the leaf, but not enough that it should take it away, take the focal point away from where it is. So you've always got to consider that. Don't overdo the leaves. Now, of course, you could. The option is there to actually have the leaves the focal point. But in the exercise that I am producing for you, the leaves are not the focal point. Right, here we've got the stalk. I'm just adding a little bit here. You're going to see why I'm leaving these gaps in a minute. The bottom here might have a tiny little bit extra shadow. Then I will add a little more color over the top. Whenever you put in a tonal color, like dark sepia, do remember to add something over the top of it as well. It just helps blend it in. Now, I'm not pressing particularly hard, even though this is my foreground leaf. I really do not want to press very hard. You can already see the subtle difference between the layering here and the layering there, where, remember, I put a layer of white first. And the layer of white is what makes it pop off the paper that much more. By excluding that layer of white, it kind of recedes into the paper a little bit. And that's what we want, because it's not the focal point. However, we still want a fair bit of detailing. Let me add some other color here. Let's just bump up a little bit of the yellowy color on the edge there. And I will probably need a little more highlight in places. So I'm doing the leaf, but I'm not slavishly doing it. Now, what you need to consider is, when you have a leaf, is the edge that is closest to you will often show a slight lightness. When the leaf is green, you actually have this row of transparent cells on the edge of every leaf. And that kind of glows towards you. And it helps separate out leaves when you are doing a whole lot. Now, when a leaf has lost all its sap, you're not going to see that row of transparent cells. However, in an artwork, it does help give the leaf shape if you just consider it. So that which goes away from me, I'm not going to see them there. However, I'm going to pick it up again here. And it just shows up gradually and gently. I'm toning it back a little bit, knocking it back a little bit by putting a bit of yellow on it. I don't want it as a bright white mark. But you can see it just gives it a little extra shape. But it's entirely up to you how much of that you do or don't want to show. It does depend on your overall composition. Let's just add a little bit extra dark. Now, I'm not going to overdo this leaf at all. That, I think, is going to give me quite sufficient as my leaf in the foreground. Remember, this is a foreground leaf, this is midground, and that's going to be background. So That I think is quite sufficient. In no way is it competing with my acorn, which is my focal point. It's just there. Right, just needs a little extra shape going out that way, I think. That will do. Now let's start working up this with a little more detailing, but I've got to be very, very careful that I don't take the attention away from here. So let me just start on the stalk. I've put my basic layer of color down. I want to think tonal value because there's always tonal value. So I'm going to put my little bit of dark, again working with dark sepia, on my shadow side of the stalk. I'm working very gently. I'm going to put my little bit of light on the light side of the stalk, working very gently. I don't want to pop it. Here you can see the light is far more popped, whereas this is quite gentle. And what I'm going to do down the middle, because I have a little more room, is I'm just going to consider a little bit of a highlight running down, especially this thicker area of stalk. I don't think I'm going to bother with the darkness running down there at this stage. Now, if I felt I needed to, I could just tone that light down, and I could equally just tone the dark down by just running a little bit of the brown over the top. But I still need the tonal value, but I do not want it as exaggerated as what I have focal point. Now I have to think overall shape. And this is where it becomes entirely up to you, what you feel, where you want to bend it, and so on and so forth. Okay, so if my light is coming upper left, everything that's on the lower right side is likely to have a bit of dark. So let's just go in with my dark sepia. Remember, I want to work quite gently. And I have to bear in mind that my leaf has got quite a lot of bumps now. It's not quite as dried out as this one, but it has quite a lot of bumps and curves and what have you. So, and I don't mind if my dark is next to this dark, because it kind of loses it into the dark of the leaf, and that's quite nice. Now, when you are laying this in, try not to get too much of a linear structure. So I'm working with quite a short elliptical line. So it's round and round and round, but I'm not doing just a circle. It is still an ellipse. And I'm just thinking of where would the light likely to catch. Maybe that's a bumpy bit, so perhaps down here there would be a slightly more gentle bit. Now you will notice, remember when I put the darks in up here, I put them in with a little bit more oomph and welly, because that's my foreground leaf. This one is midground. And so although I need all the darks and the detailing and so on, I need it applied a little more gently. I don't want to build up as much of sort of density of layer as what I have. Now I'm just guessing where the darks would be, because as I say, my leaves are a little bit too crunchy, but I'm just thinking about an interesting shape. Where is it likely to catch a bit more dark? It might catch a bit more dark in there. And yet here, I think that's going to really catch the light. But there might be a little bit of a darkness just underneath my vein there. There might be a little bit darkness coming through. Again, remember not to make it too linear. Lots and lots and lots of soft, varying in direction ellipses. Might look a bit weird at the moment. Don't worry, just live with it. As we go down here, this is likely to be a really highlighted area. But maybe there's a dark patch there that's coming in. And you can see how I'm just working my way along. Let's have a look at this little section here that I'm doing and work it more to completion so you can see what I mean. But quite gently, not too much detailing, and the application of pencil is soft. Right, let's now consider some highlights. I'm working with ivory as I have done here, There I used white because I wanted it to pop. Here I'm using ivory because I don't want it to pop too much. So I'm just adding a little bit of a highlight here. You can see how gently I'm working. There I added with more oomph. Here it's just a little bit of a highlight. There a little bit of a highlight. Might just be catching the edge. I have to also consider, which is exactly what I mentioned to you earlier, is areas where the leaf is facing me, that leading edge. How much of that do I show? So I don't want to show it at the top there, but perhaps down here, I'm going to break it up a little bit. I may show it there, just a smidgen. Then I'll break it up. By breaking it up, I mean just a slightly jiggedy-jaggedy line. I'm not going to show it there. So although I have a highlight on the end, I don't have the leading edge showing. Whereas here, watch how I'm breaking it up. So it's not a straight line. There it was straighter and stronger because that was my foreground leaf. Then I'm probably going to lose it down there again. As it goes away from my eye, I'm likely to lose it. Here I would pick it up again, this edge that as it comes towards me, but I'm breaking it up, not hard line. Right, so you see I'm still following that. If I were to move on to the other side, I wouldn't see any of it there, but as this came towards me, I would see a little bit of it there. So I'm still putting the detail that I need, even though this is mid-ground, it still has an accurate level of detail, but it's not as crisp and sharp as that one is. That one I could have crisper and sharper because it's foreground, but also because of its rather indistinct shape, I knew it wouldn't compete with this. So there's all these things that you have to actually think about. Art is very much more about being a thinking artist than just doing. You've got to think about what you are actually putting on the paper. Is it making sense? Is it working? Right, let's just have a look at this now. I'm just adding a few highlights. I'll have a little bit of a highlight possibly on this side here. And equally, if I've got a bit of a highlight there, I would have a subtle darkness on that side. And this just comes with much observation of leaves to know that if the light's coming from the upper left, often it's that side that's highlighted because of the fold of the leaf. Right, let's just think about that little section. I've added a few bits and bobs. Now I need to blend them in. And it's quite a challenge because I've used lots of colours. So it's a case of, well, more or less the colour that you have used underneath, you're going to put a bit of that on the top. Now you're not really burnishing, because remember, burnishing is generally when you apply pressure to mix the colours. Here you really are not applying pressure, but you can see that just by repeatedly going over and over and over quite gently with the orange color that I had underneath, that dark sepia is just blending in a little more. I want to just make sure that this little extra edge that's showing a leading edge is not too obvious. So it's all about gentleness and tactful application. Here, I think there was a little green underneath in places. So I'll just tickle a little green over it in areas. Remember, this is not a very shiny surface. So although you need light areas and dark areas, your tonal value, you're not working towards shine. You're just working towards subtle lights and darks. And here you can see it's just softly starting to blend together. If you have a look at that little area there compared with some of the areas not yet blended, you can see what I mean. It's just softly blending areas together, not much pressure. You can put a number of layers on, but not much pressure. And that's the trick. So it's not really like your usual burnish, which is quite a lot of pressure. This is just layering, and it works particularly successfully on this paper because of the tooth of the paper. The grip of the paper actually allows these layers. I think I just want to bump up that highlighted area slightly more. In my mind's eye, it's a sort of a bulge that's coming out. Now, this kind of process can take a fair time, because what you're doing is you're actually just looking and comparing and saying, yep, that looks like a believable enough leaf. But the whole time I am considering, don't let it take the attention away from this. So you've got to think quite a bit about what it is you're actually doing. Notice I'm not working with a very sharp point, and I have got quite a distinct oblique angle there, which means that I can apply these gentle layers of pressure and just slowly. Notice I'm still doing this ellipse. Now it's a slightly longer ellipse, and I'm lingering in an area for as long as I need to visually see what is happening and saying that's the effect I want. So I continue on round and round and round. A little bit of green here. Remember, there must be local color showing. Not everything is highlighted or shadowed. There's lots of local color showing. I think I could do with just a little smoother application here of my highlight. And because I laid it in like that to begin with, I've created a few marks. So if I'm just going to put a little more, I'm just going in right angles and still keeping the elliptical motion. Then I'm going to just blend that softly back. So it's quite a relaxing process, this. You just look at what's in front of you and you slowly go back and forth until you get a believable enough, rather lovely looking autumny leaf with a bit of greens and browns. You might want to make them a whole lot greener or a whole lot browner. That's entirely up to you. But greens and browns softly blended together. Notice the difference here again. This section, just that little bit is completely different to that because I haven't yet put in a layer. Remember, I'm not pressing hard. I'm just busy layering it up, and I need to change direction slightly, change the way you actually apply it in the elliptical motion. Sometimes you go this way, sometimes you go that way, clockwise or anti-clockwise, up to you. The darks are generally quite strong. You may need to reapply lighter areas, but whatever you need to do is you've got to constantly compare the light of this with any light here. Don't let this light dominate. It's not the focal point. I know I sound like a stuck record, but it really is worth considering the whole time. Thinking artist, remember. Let me just tweak up that slight light edge that might be coming towards me. That's better. It just adds that little element of variation. It's when a viewer looks at your work, they're not going to dwell on all these finer details down here. They're going to look there first. But you do want these finer details. It must still look believable. And it must look like a proper leaf. Right, you can see how that has come on quite nicely. Now, there are other areas. There are sort of darker marks and things like that on autumn leaves. And that's entirely up to you how much of that you add. Sometimes it can be distracting. Let's just have a look at this. You can see all these dark sort of splodges here and there. Now you can add them with pleasure, but bear in mind sometimes they can be distracting. So what I would suggest is if you're going to add a darker splodge, don't use a particularly dark color. You can always strengthen it. Add a darker splodge here or there, but make the edges just slightly indistinct, so that it doesn't catch the eye. Remember, this is mid-ground. If we were doing an entire study of leaves, that would be a completely different thing. But our emphasis on this particular artwork happens to be the acorn. So it would depend on you where your emphasis lay. So I can do these dark splodges here. If I need them a little stronger, I certainly can go in and make them a little stronger. Maybe I could make them a little redder even in areas, but not enough to become distracting. That is the consideration. I mean, I've used this burnt sienna there, so there's nothing wrong with tickling in a little burnt sienna in some of these dark marks, but not enough to make it distracting. Right, I'm going to continue with the same on that leaf, and then I'll show you how we're going to throw this cast shadow. Here you can see how I have simply gone over the whole leaf in the same manner I described here. I may do a little more to it, I may not. What I want to do now, however, is to throw the cast shadow, because the acorn must be throwing some kind of shadow. Now, if I have a look at my photographic reference, that shadow is very, very harsh, and I am certainly not going to cast a shadow as harsh as that. Many times they work brilliantly in photographs, but they don't work particularly well in artworks. It becomes too heavy. However, there has to be some kind of shadow. So, working with my dark sepia, and I know that the light is coming from my left-hand side, it means there has to be some kind of shadow here. I don't often have very hard-edged shadows. And what I'm also going to do is consider that there's actually a bit of distance between my acorn and my leaf. Here, the acorn is almost sitting on the leaf, which is why it's a very hard-edged shadow. Here, I'm just going to, on mine, I'm going to make sure there is a shadow, but it's a little higher up. So, let me just get a bit of a point on my dark sepia, because I want to be reasonably precise, working right next to the edge here. I'm not pressing hard. I do want a shadow, but I don't want a very hard shadow. And it's going to be somewhat indistinct. It's going to help me define that edge, however, which is quite nice, but gently. And just starting to blend away from this edge here, working right over what I have on the paper. And I would rather press, as I've mentioned many a time, rather press a little more softly and yet repeatedly than press too hard, because that's where you can make mistakes, and then you've got to rub right back to the very beginning and start again, and it's not so good. So very, very gently. Let me just turn it the right way around so we can see how we're going. Just going to change direction. I don't want it to become too linear. And even if you are working in a long elliptical stroke, it can become too linear. So just round and round and round gently. And you can see how it's working. It's much softer than my photographic reference. I don't want it any harder than this. And what happens with shadows is right next to the object, it's reasonably strong. And yet further away from the object, it becomes more and more diffuse. And that's something that you as an artist can simply decide how much you do or do not want to show. If you think at any time that a really good strong shadow is going to complement the work, then feel free to put it in. But I'm always inclined to rather do it a little more gently. I don't want the shadow to become dominant. It needs to be there just to make it believable, but it mustn't become dominant. I'm just going straight over the work. As you can see, those little bits of color show through. If I need to emphasize any of the color again, I can, but I don't think I'll need to. I don't think I'm going to throw much more It'll go up a little higher perhaps, just thinking where the light is coming from. So it can possibly go up a little higher, but I don't think it's going to go too much further down. It's always a bit of a guessing game, but things can change. Light sources change fractionally. Directions of light change fractionally. And I don't imagine anybody viewing the artwork is really going to challenge you, particularly if you do the shadow gently like this. If you have a very hard shadow, there is room for it to look odd. But if it's a soft shadow, just softly blending away, it's fine. Now that personally I feel is sufficient as a shadow. If you are looking at the overall work, you will notice that this leaf, whilst there's a fair amount of detail, it's in no way taking the attention away from that. This leaf is a little stronger because it's also foreground. So we have foreground, midground, background. It is a little stronger, but because it's small, again, it's not taking the attention away from that. Now, our background leaf, you are going to do in exactly the same manner as this, but you're going to do it that much more gently. So it's really got to be gently applied. Before I add too many other colors, which I can do, I'm actually going to go in with the tonal value really, really gently. So I'm thinking from the beginning, now where would my shadow be? This is a background leaf, but nonetheless it still has to have tonal value. So I'm working it up same way as I did that, exactly the same way, but softly. I'm hardly touching the paper, just a tickle. This will also have a little bit of tonal value coming through there. There might be a smidgen of lightness, but that's going away from the light. The bottom here would need a little bit. So the whole time you are thinking exactly the same as you thought for either of those, but the application is more gentle. Right here, there can be a little more pressure because it's right next to this. And then it goes further away. It's all about, as an artist, what you want the viewer to see. You don't want this background leaf to be dominant. It would look weird. You want to add these different levels of interest within the actual artwork. I can just tickle up the shape of that slightly, but I'm hardly touching the paper. It's a deliberate attempt to recede this leaf into the background. Right, let's just turn it around so you can see what's happening there. A little bit more detailing there, but not a whole lot. It's deliberately receding. Or thinking about it logically, all this side would be slightly more shadowed. What part is going to catch the highlight? It's likely to be these bits there. We'll still have our little line at the bottom, those leading edges, remember, that I spoke about, but very, very gentle application. So let's put in a few of those leading edges. May just help you see exactly where you're going. So this edge here, whoops, you can't see it. This edge here would be a leading edge, but very gently. Right, I don't want that to yell. That won't, because that part goes away from me. This, however, will also be, and I'm just breaking it up as I did on the other leaf, so there's not a straight line. That would be a leading edge, that would go away. This bit here would be a bit of a leading edge. I'll turn it around the other way in a second, and then you can see it more clearly. Here, a little bit of a leading edge. That goes away from me. This would show up, this side. That, nothing. That's far away from me. But this part would just show a little bit of a leading edge. Let's turn it around and you can see immediately how just those tiny little bits of extra light, even though I've done them very, very gently, just to describe to the viewer that this is, that's the shape of the leaf. And it does make a difference. Right, let's just put in our little areas of dark. When you are doing a background leaf like this, whilst it still needs the same level of detail, the detail has to be applied really gently. So it actually appears as if there's less detail. But there isn't really. You're still doing the same level of consideration the whole way through. If this is your vein, where is the shadow likely to be? Which parts have got shadow? The shape of the leaf, the curve of the leaf. Which bits would be catching highlights? Maybe this part here would be actually shadowed a little bit. Of course, when you're doing an autumn leaf, they can vary so, because some parts of them are more likely to be falling off soon and other parts are not. So you're having to think all of this stuff through. If you're working from life, it almost makes it easier because it's in front of you. Which bits are likely to be more crumpled than other bits? Let's just lose, we don't want to lose that completely. Let's have a little bit of shadow coming through there. Right, let's put a little bit of highlight in now so we can just see a bit more clearly where we're going. That bit I'm going to just highlight slightly. The top part there, I'm just going to highlight slightly. But then I'm going to be careful I don't lose this part. So I may need to just strengthen up this stalk a little bit. This is what I mean by, as an artist, you have to constantly compare what you are doing. So that's my highlighted edge, but perhaps this section here is a little more highlighted. And perhaps that edge is a little more highlighted. Often if you can fill in the edges, not as just a straight line, but you're giving the viewer something to allow their eye to wander. So if I can emphasize that edge there, I'm not worrying much about this. The viewer's eye will just naturally fill it in. And bear in mind, this is a background leaf. So it's quite far in the background. I'm deliberately putting an extra little bit of light just there, tactful, but just there, because darkest part of the foreground, a little bit of extra light behind it in the background image just emphasizes it. Now all that, which I did exactly the same down here, I'm just going to tickle a little bit of the base color over the top, very gently, just to help kind of blend it together. But it really is a gentle application, even more gentle than there. And in this background leaf, I really do not think I will put many marks. I may put a few, but I won't put many because I don't want it in any way to catch the eye too much. I want to deliberately recede it into the paper. I'm really working quite hard at trying to get it to recede. So none of my darks are particularly dark. None of my lights are particularly light, but they are there. And you can see already that's looking quite complete. I don't need to do much more there. It's got shape, it's got form, it's got tonal value. I don't want it to be as strong as this one, and certainly not as strong as that one. So I have my very clear foreground, midground, background. Let's just complete the end here. And again, very, very gently thinking where there might be a little bit of a shadow coming through. Maybe a little smidgen up here still. Softly, softly, softly. Again, that works quite nicely, having a little bit of a shadow there because of the nice light edge on the acorn cup. It works quite well. Here I think I'll have a little bit of shadow coming up from the stalk, well, I'm sorry, the mid vein. Very, very random, nothing terribly definite. It is there, but it's not terribly definite. It doesn't want to pull your eye in any particular way. Towards the edge here, I'm going to be very gentle. How much I do or don't put on. Let's have a little dark coming through there. because I really would like the tip of that leaf to not quite disappear, but to almost disappear into the edge of the paper, into the color of the background, really. Putting in a few extra lights, that is likely to catch a little extra light there, and I'll pull it down. I won't put any light near there. This part might catch a little extra light. Just so that I don't want to put light here, even though it might be there. I don't want to put it there because of the fact I don't want light next to light. So you can see this edge of this leaf, I'm doing probably even less detailing than what I did down there, because it just needs to show up just slightly. Doesn't need a lot. Then I will go in again and just put a tickle of the local kind of color, and you can see I'm not bumping up the color much here. I'm keeping it quite understated and unimportant. I'm allowing the color of the paper to show through rather than adding too many extra oranges or anything like that. I don't want anything to pull this particular leaf forward. Just an extra little wash over the top. And that, I think, is quite sufficient for that leaf. There's really very little need to do any more to it. It's a background leaf. There's enough detailing on it to show the viewer that you know what you're doing. Let me just put a tickle over there on that tip. It just looked a little strong. That's better. And I think that that is sufficient. So I would consider this autumn picture of Acorns and Oak Leaves complete.